From the campus of Yale University, this is Business Talk with Jim Campbell, nationally syndicated across the country on the Biz Talk Radio Network and coming to you from our flagship stations, Yale Radio WYBC and 1490 AM WGCH Greenwich. All talk and all business, 60 minutes of radio with leading figures from the world of business along with the business of politics and sports. The men who went to the moon in the mission of a lifetime, pushing the boundaries of space, faith, and optimism against all odds, JFK's moonshot, an American success story for humankind everywhere from a time when anything seemed possible. Lessons learned from the heroes of NASA's space program. That's all tonight on Business Talk with Jim Campbell. Basil Hero is an award-winning former investigative reporter with NBC News from childhood and throughout his career as a media entrepreneur. Basil's maintained a lifelong fascination with space exploration and the men who went to the moon. He's a graduate of Tufts University and the Choate School, both of which we were in the same class, coincidentally. So particularly proud to have him join us. He's in studio today. That book is The Mission of a Lifetime, Lessons from the Men Who Went to the Moon. Welcome, Basil. Good to see you again.
Well, good to see you, Jamie, and thank
By
you
the way,
for...
Sorry, looking at your bio, I think, on your website, you had lost a lot on 9/11, right? I was in 2 World Trade, not then, but years before, and 2 World Trade, 5 World Trade, and 130 Liberty, all 3 destroyed.
Yep. So, I was actually there the morning it happened, and I had to evacuate my office, of course, and I saw the second plane go in, and it was just horrifying.
And you lost 35,000 pictures?
We had acquired the rights to In Theater Magazine's photo library, and so we were actually in the process of digitizing it in our offices at that point. Now, our videotape library was being duplicated and restored up in Vermont, so our major assets were not destroyed.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah.
Okay, so you got the right last name for Heroes, which is the subject of your book. Tell us how you decided to write it and give us a little backstory.
Well, I wanted to do something entirely different. There have been hundreds and hundreds of books written about the Apollo program. They all focused on their missions and the specifics of it and the mechanics of the missions. And I felt that there was an opportunity, particularly as these men are now approaching their 90s and recognizing that their role in history is about to be written finally. And I thought that they might be willing to discuss the sorts of things that they would not have, say, 10, 15, 20 years ago. The role of courage, how to manage one's fear, their perception of God and spirituality, and also the common good, which is a phrase that you don't hear much these days. And I wanted to do a deep dive into the right stuff and re-examine that.
Did you come up with the name the Eagles, which you call them throughout the book? And how'd you get them to talk, and how did it work?
I did come up with the name Eagles, and it really was a function of my interviews with them. And you can tell a lot about someone by their eyes and the alertness.
I noticed you put that in a lot. Yeah.
Yes. And it struck me that their mission patches, so many of them, was the eagle. And they reminded me, when I looked into their eyes, they reminded me of eagles. And, of course, it is a majestic symbol, and so thus the name the Eagles. And the way I got to them, frankly, was through Andy Turnage over at the Space Explorer Society and also the executive director over at the Astronaut Scholarship Foundation. And I really was put through the hurdles with these men. They wanted to vet me. They didn't know me at all. They had no idea what the topic was. And essentially what they were saying was, prove to us that you're doing something that hasn't already been done. And I prepared a 2-page memo for Bill Anders, who ultimately took the Earthrise photo, which helped launch the environmental movement. Anders was impressed with what I put together and said, okay, I think you're onto something that is really worth talking about.
I thought it was very cool, too, because then as soon as you passed muster, he passed you on to Frank Borman or somebody who then passed you on. So you sort of earned your stripes. as you went along. And I guess there were only 24 guys
exactly
that were in the program, and of which 12 are still alive. Or
correct.
Okay, so what's the traits you found, the commonalities across the folks you got to?
I would say humility is really at the top of the list. If you consider
just like our current president.
Oh yeah. It's extraordinary to see how these men have maintained this quiet humility, and they abhor celebrity culture. Mike Collins, who was on the Apollo 11 mission, which was the first moon landing, articulates it really quite well when he decries the culture and its celebration of celebrity and inflated heroism. The other one who was very interesting was Alan Bean, who was the fourth man to walk on the moon, who said that all these elected officials should rip those lapel pins with the American flag off of their chest because they're false patriots and self-serving jackasses. Their heroes are the ones who went to Vietnam, for example. As unpopular as the war was, they felt that the Congressional Medal of Honor was the ultimate acid test in heroism.
What were the fundamental traits that NASA used to pick these guys?
They were looking for a rare combination of courage, an appreciation for fear, but not mindless fearlessness. And they needed to be highly educated. So they had to have a very finely tuned appreciation of risk and a willingness to take risk, but grounded in intense preparation. So the psychological profiles revealed men who were courageous, but highly educated and willing to sort of pull back at that last moment from recklessness and this notion of a daredevil, which was quite common in the 20s. They would never have done the things that daredevils did.
You know what? One of the things that surprised me the most is they're sort of in the test pilot mode, or wherever you call that niche. How dangerous that was! How many people were killed?
Oh, it was incredible. If you go back and look at the numbers, it was if you hear Armstrong and Borman tell it was basically one a week. They lost 62 pilots over at Nellis Air Force Base, where a lot of the testing of aircraft was taking place.
Did they have conquer the mountain syndrome, which, like Alexander the Great, they conquered the world at relatively young ages, and then had to go on? And Frank Borman and who was the other? Anders, I think, had tremendous corporate careers, right? Yes.
They did. That's correct. Anders went on to become the president and CEO of General Dynamics. I interviewed Warren Buffett, who's my hero. Okay, very good. He certainly is one of mine as well. And what he said was that he was so impressed with Anders' courage and the ability to make tough decisions at GD. And it is generally considered one of the greatest corporate turnarounds. Frank Borman did a marvelous job over at Eastern Airlines and actually used many of the management techniques that he learned at NASA over at Eastern.
I'll give you a chance now to give the wives a little kudo, because the flip side of unemotional, rational, objective performance is maybe not giving their wives that. Talk about, and I think you say that people consider the wives braver even.
Yes, what I wanted to do to contemporize this for today's audiences was to talk to the Navy SEALs and the head psychologist for the Navy SEALs, Dr. Eric Potterat, and he helped train the SEALs who killed Osama bin Laden. And he too said that the wives of the SEALs were in effect braver than the SEALs, and Dr. Patricia Santee, who was NASA's flight surgeon for 10 years, said the same of the astronaut wives. And the reason is this: the astronauts and the SEALs know exactly what it is they're signing up for. They know the risk of death, but they don't become plagued by it. For the wives, there was really the fear of the unknown. And of course, the SEALs and NASA weren't about to tell the wives, the blow-by-blow details of just how risky these ventures were.
And I guess some of the unfortunate side of that, there's 60% divorce. There was alcoholism problems. There was depression problems. But overall, a great story. And we're getting into the next segment. The deadline that JFK set a decade out, probably one of the greatest organizational feats ever.
Yes.
And we'll be right back with more on leadership.
Choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win, and the others too.
We're back with former investigative reporter Basil Hero, talking about heroes to the moon. That, of course, was JFK setting the mission. And there were some other amazing things I learned from your book. Before that speech, the U.S. had a total of 15 minutes in space. People won't remember this, but we were losing the space race. And we just had the Bay of Pigs where Kennedy was badly beaten. Talk a little bit about setting the mission.
Well, Kennedy, it was an extraordinarily bold mission that he set forth. And the first reaction at NASA from their key executives was not unlike the bankers who heard Walt Disney say that he was going to create an empire out of an animated mouse. They threw him out of the office. And that was somewhat the same reaction that the NASA people had. Of course, the major difference was that Congress was prepared to throw $20 billion at NASA. Disney never got a dime from the bankers. So if you have that kind of money in the bank, then you know that there is a serious effort underway to make it happen. And Kennedy set a very clear goal and vision. Moon, end of the decade, get it done.
Pretty amazing. And could you imagine today any kind of a long-term thinking like that coming out of Washington?
Impossible.
Impossible.
It would not happen. And social media would have killed it. And I can give you a specific example of how. Had the Saturn V rocket not been built, we never would have made it to the moon. Well, who built the Saturn V rocket? It was the former Nazi rocket scientist, von Braun, and his team of 137 Germans. Today, social media would have lit up like a pinball machine, and they never, ever would have allowed the government to employ them and put them on such a project.
I thought the politics behind it were brilliant. Not only was the mission clear, but they got double the funding so that the buffer was there, and then they put NASA on the property of in the area, I think in the district maybe of LBJ.
Correct.
So you're going to get, and he controlled Congress.
Exactly. So Jim Webb, who had worked as the director of the budget in the Truman administration, but also had extensive experience in private industry, and particularly with the contractors who ultimately built the Apollo spacecraft. And he immediately said to Kennedy, "You got to double the budget." He'd seen too many businesses and government ventures fail for lack of funding.
Okay, we'll get to sort of a hidden story here, which was the organizational management leadership genius behind that. Talk about some of the leadership management techniques. And by the way, define moral courage, which, of course, Kennedy was showing there.
Well, moral courage, as he wrote in Profiles in Courage, is to take on a mission that has a low chance of success, which can personally damage you, the person leading the charge, but is so important to the culture at large and the common good that one must display it in order to achieve great human endeavors. And certainly the NASA people had it. They needed to go from 0 to 60 to meet Kennedy's deadline. They needed to do it in 7 years. And they invented the management techniques, which are still present to this day. To put it in a nutshell, they pioneered the flat organization. And what was important there was to have as few layers as possible between the decision makers and, in this case, the engineers. Lives depended on it. And everything that informed their decision making was the 99.9% reliability rate. They wanted to have zero defects. And if you do the math on a spacecraft and a rocket that combined had 5.6 million parts, that meant that 5,600 things could go wrong. So they had excellent communication between the divisions. Mueller created something called the five-box management structure, which was an overlay over the entire organization of what amounted to 400,000 people building the aircraft.
You know what amazed me in the flat organization thing is that's a generation ahead of when that hit corporate America.
Correct.
Because as you know, corporate America was on a military top-down, tight control. These guys really came out of the military and to be so far ahead of schedule. Some of these techniques, right, you can talk about clear mission, vision, hire the best people.
There were basically 10 points. A, to have a clear mission. You have to find leaders with vision. You then have to hire the very best people, have sufficient funding, which we've discussed, the ability to delegate authority and trust the people underneath you, foster teamwork, and then owning up to mistakes and doing so in real time. If something was wrong at the most basic engineering level, there needed to be a clear communication path to the higher-ups, and that existed, and they really encouraged the engineers to report any mistakes and to not sit on them. This broke down a little bit with the development of the first iteration of the Apollo spacecraft when they had the Apollo 1 fire. And what happened there was the manager of the Apollo manufacturing failed to report defects that were troubling the astronauts and reporting it above. And by the time it was recognized, it was too late. And, of course, we had the Apollo fire with 3 astronauts who died, and it put NASA on a 2-year hiatus while they corrected the problems.
How'd they get the team play to be so effective and so seamless?
It was a question, again, of hiring the right people and entrusting them. And over at Mission Control, which was the public-facing nerve center, they actually hired kids right out of college, which was amazing. And mostly they had to become literate in computer technology, which was in its infancy. And they wanted to be able to mold them and have them become engineers who were adaptable, flexible, and willing to work what amounted to 16-hour days.
How'd they define calculated risks? Because it's interesting, you look at in 2008, the financial crash was basically Wall Street taking on reckless risk.
Mm-hmm. Well, calculated risk comes on the heels of immense preparation. So when we say that there was a 50-50 chance of them landing on the moon, you have to remember that they simulated every conceivable failure. They trained in those simulators collectively for over 20,000 hours. And there were redundancies built into the system. So if something failed, they went to Plan B. And if Plan B failed, they went to Plan C. And they simulated all of those, what they called realistic failures. They did not want to have catastrophic failures because that led to a lack of self-confidence.
Wow. And we're going to get to Men on the Moon next.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Back with Basil Hero. His book is The Mission of a Lifetime, lessons from the men who went to the moon. That, of course, was Neil Armstrong. Talk a little bit about that. And I hadn't realized that there was also not a high probability, maybe 50-50 of the lunar module getting off the ground there. And then they might have spent some time there then.
Exactly. They would have become a permanent monument to the lunar program. Armstrong is someone I would describe as a quiet genius. I think he was a genius. And he's not given enough credit for it.
Very modest.
Yes, very modest. And if you think of the magnitude of the weight on his shoulders to successfully navigate the first moon landing, and then to not become essentially prostituted by it, which was not the case with his crewmate Buzz Aldrin. Armstrong, throughout his life, his main concern and goal was to educate the next generation. So he taught immediately after his career at NASA. He devoted himself to really the common good and the public. And he was very reticent to do any kind of interviews that weren't completely devoted to science and the advancement of the space program. He was a very deep thinker. He read extensively, knew the Greek classics, Plato and Aristotle, and quoted them quite frequently. And I think the most amazing statement that he made was 2 years before the end of his life, where he said that he did not believe that we had evolved enough as a species to colonize the rest of the universe.
Wow. I did not know until I read this day. He overshot the landing spot by 4 miles.
He did. The computer programs were running a little bit afoul, and the computer alarms went off, which distracted them. His heart rate had jumped to 160, which, according to the doctors, are all of the signs of physiological fear. But you listen to his voice, and he is as calm as can be. Yes. So what you find with the Eagles is that they learned how to master and conquer their fear. It wasn't that they were fearless, because that would suggest almost idiocy. And they trained to suppress it and to have plenty of options to get themselves out of a tight situation.
So let's jump to the other extreme then. Failure is not an option. That's, Jim Lovell in the Apollo 13. By the way, you saw Jim Lovell. Is he from Lake Forest, Illinois? This is my hometown, and I've heard that I think him or one of the astronauts lives there.
He does live there. He grew up actually in Wisconsin, and as with all the Apollo astronauts, he lived in Houston for quite some time, but that's where he lives now. And I went to visit him in his home, along with his wife Marilyn, who were both made quite famous by the movie. And what Lovell said to me was that the most important quality a human being can have is optimism. And then he made a statement which just knocked me off my chair. And he said that after 50 years of reflection, he's come to the conclusion that we don't go to heaven when we die. We go to heaven when we're born. I had never heard that before. And I interviewed the head of the Yale Divinity School, Greg Sterling, and he said he had never heard it either. And it's this extraordinary transposition of the ascension narrative. And it was born of his trip to the moon. What all of these Apollo astronauts concluded was that the Earth is the Garden of Eden, that we have failed to appreciate it, and it is our job, our solemn duty, to do everything we can to preserve Mother Earth.
And I guess when you're up there looking back, these little wars we seem to be fighting everywhere don't make a lot of sense to them.
None whatsoever. They even asked, is the Earth inhabited?
This whole thing, it's pretty profound. The other, if you take of us at a big risk writing a book, or as I'm trying to do right now, it's hard to avoid the catastrophic what-ifs or the fear of failure.
Yes.
But that was something that they kept under control.
They did keep it under control. And interestingly, you can go back to as far as World War I, where Winston Churchill's doctor, Lord Moran, was the first person to study courage in his book, The Anatomy of Courage. He described the very same techniques that were used by World War I and II pilots the Navy SEALs and the astronauts, which is something they call front sight focus, which means you have to focus directly on what is in front of you and the task at hand. And if you remain focused and present-oriented, and in today's vernacular, mindful, and you immerse yourself in the moment, then that tends to eliminate fear.
No one has been on the moon since 1972, as I learned in this book as well. Can we still do moonshots, and why did we seem to lose interest in the space program?
I believe we can still do moonshots. I think it's going to require the same energy and dedicated effort that existed during the Apollo era. You do have Jeff Bezos, whom I interviewed for this book as well, and Bezos believes that he can have a lunar lander ready to go by about 2023, 24, that we should in fact start colonizing the moon and using it as essentially a launch pad to the rest of the solar system.
Was the space shuttle considered a failure? And one thing that surprised me is that it was supposed to come in at 10% of the cost, and it came in at 10 times the cost of NASA, which is a 100-fold miss.
Well, Bill Anders, who actually helped the Nixon administration select the shuttle, he actually wanted the smaller version of the shuttle because it would have cost a lot less to find out if, in fact, it could give you a 10x return. It turned out that it didn't. After a certain point, once it achieved those critical missions of launching the Hubble telescope, which just opened up an entirely new perspective and view of the rest of the solar system, aside from that, and launching satellites, it really very rapidly started losing its scientific sort of return.
Now, Kennedy laid out this very clear vision, whole country behind it. Since then, we've had either a lack of interest in NASA or presidents changing the mission left and right.
There's no consistency, and you need to have consistency from one administration to the other. I'm not sure that we're going to get back there anytime soon, quite frankly. We're reinventing all the technologies that took place 50 years ago. It's sad.
And there's a lot of criticism that with all the problems domestically, cities, education, then why are we spending money on space? But the fact is, we get a big bang for the buck from the technology created and brought back.
We do. That's a debate that still goes on today. Why should we be spending all of this money in space when, in fact, we have problems at home? The short answer to that is there is a measurable return on investment. Clearly, that was the case with Apollo in terms of what it did for global communications, in terms of its ability to put satellites up there, particularly when we're talking about weather. So to suggest that there is no return is just incorrect.
Now, if we go back again in time, as we said, we're behind in Sputnik. The Russians are saying they're going to bury capitalism, etc. How do we end up beating them?
Fear, which is the hallmark of authoritarian societies, prevents really great accomplishments. You don't have open communication. And in order to achieve something like the moonshot, you have to have open communications, transparency. Without it, you're never going to find out the mistakes that are happening at the bottom. People will not be encouraged to speak up. And that sort of fear, I think, produces negative results. There's no question that with the moonshot, you had this rare combination of government coming together with private industry in a partnership that had really never been attempted before. And for those people who think that government is just organically, innately dysfunctional, I would say look to NASA, look what happened with the moonshot, and honestly, many of the current accomplishments of NASA.
All right, 30 seconds. What surprised you most about the whole project?
I think that the devotion to the common good and the spiritual changes that they underwent, the humility. It's such a powerful reminder today where boastfulness, where ego are just on display, and the pursuit of money to the exclusion of everything else, and quiet courage and patriotism, duty, honor, country, which sound somewhat quaint. These are the qualities and values that I think we need to resurface again in our country.
Final national segment, Future of Space Travel. Forensic Talk with Jim Campbell. All talk and all crime. The nation's biggest murderers were the go-to source for the Moxley murder and the Skakel appeals. Financial crimes on Wall Street. Inside the crimes of Russia's Putin and more. The facts, the forensics, the inside stories. From the host of Business Talk with Jim Campbell, it's Forensic Talk with Jim Campbell. All talk and all crime.
Learn more about Forensic Talk with Jim Campbell by visiting Park City Productions 06604's Facebook page. That's Park City Productions 06604.
And we're back. Final segment with Basil Hero, lessons learned by the men who went to the moon. All right, the future of space travel, it looks like it's going towards privatization. And is that a good thing?
Well, let's not forget that in the Apollo era, you did, in fact, have a massive partnership with private contractors. So NASA, when it started out in 1958, by 1960, they had 10,000 employees. It then went up to 36,000, but the remaining 370,000 were from private industry. So the template exists. The difference is today you don't have Congress giving NASA the kind of money it needs to help jumpstart private industry. So really the Eagles, as I've called them, are putting their money on Jeff Bezos. And the reason is this. A, he can fund his own space program at $1 billion a year. But more to the point, they believe in his gradatum ferocitor philosophy, which means step-by-step ferociously. Their biggest single concern is safety. And they think his step-by-step approach is safer than Musk's. Now, Musk, to be fair to Musk, has had more launches than anyone. Their fear is that maybe the corners might be cut. They don't know, but they openly state their preference for him.
Which is interesting. And Musk has been able to develop stuff cheaper than NASA. His mission is different from Blue Origin Bezos, right?
It is. Musk is obsessed with going to Mars.
Yeah.
And Bezos and other scientists would say to you, that's a far more complicated endeavor. So, for example, Bill Anders was scheduled to address Musk's board. But when he told his assistant that they had not properly addressed the radiation issues, he was promptly disinvited by Musk. It takes 9 months to get to Mars, and you can only resupply it every 2 years. The moon is a far different animal. It only takes 3 days to get there. So the turnaround time to supply lunar bases is much faster, and you can then build rockets on the moon as opposed to having to create something like a Saturn V, which is a massive undertaking. And the biggest advantage to the moon at this point, its greatest resource, is helium-3. Which could revolutionize the nuclear power industry, and it's now currently valued at $5 billion per ton. So there's going to be a race to the moon to get that. Yeah.
That's fascinating. And if you look at what's going on at Tesla right now, it doesn't give you a lot of confidence in Musk, because one of the problems that are coming out of there, and secondly, one of the big things you talk about is admitting mistakes and being transparent. He's clearly putting a sheen on, the problems they're having.
Yes, they see him as a promoter and a showboater, which is the worst thing to an Apollo astronaut. They have no tolerance for that at all. Again, quiet courage and humility.
Talk about Richard Branson now. What is his mission?
Branson essentially wants to take tourists into space, but it's really kind of low Earth orbit.
Which is still pretty cool,
yes,
right?
Yes, it is, absolutely. So he's taking you right to the line between Earth and space, and it's no doubt it would be a fascinating experience. He doesn't have a grander vision as Musk and Bezos.
Now, if we step back a little bit, because you've talked about Earthrise, et cetera, looking back, what does this say about the world and how we should be looking forward? And also, Mike Collins, you quote saying, we need a new paradigm, economic prosperity without growth.
I found that to be another extraordinary statement. If you examine it carefully, it upends the traditional sort of capitalist model. Yeah. And I spoke with the head of the Research Institute over at Woods Hole, which is one of the leading think tanks for climate change, and he agrees that, in fact, we have to find a way to manage our growth to the point where we are not just depleting the Earth of its resources and damaging the climate. That's the major challenge of the 21st century.
The Earthrise picture, which people will remember, Al Gore had in his office, I think. But if you look back at that, one planet, we're looking here, 194 countries, kind of. So we're kind of missing, right, the boat?
We are missing the boat. And what was most interesting for Mike Collins when they went on the world tour is he said that we kept hearing we. No one said to them, you Americans did it. They said consistently from one continent to another, we did it, we humankind. Quite something to ponder. I don't know if people would say that today because nationalism has reared its ugly head again, as has tribalism. So there was this brief moment in world history where the planet, where humans saw themselves as a planetary species. It didn't last very long, but one hopes that it might return.
From all your talks with them and also your own opinion, are they and you optimistic?
By nature, they are optimists. I am an optimist myself. The alternative is ugly, and one has to keep striving for that shining city on the hill. If you don't, what's the point of living? So I think we have to act quickly and maintain this belief that if we put our minds to a noble project, that it can succeed.
How did it change you?
I think it reminded me and reinforced what I had learned as a grade school student, that America has these qualities which can produce moonshots, that it does give people a chance, as it did my parents, who were the children of immigrants. They were able to pull themselves up by their bootstraps and succeed on the merits and on their intelligence. And that has to come back again.
And you know, it's a good way to end it. There's a lot of folks in the middle class particularly who are suffering and haven't seen the American dream. And this book shows you what the American dream was, and there's no reason why we can't continue.
And these men and women all came from very impoverished backgrounds.
Humble guys. Yep. And humble backgrounds. The book, again, is The Mission of a Lifetime, Lessons from the Men Who Went to the Moon. Basil has a website at basilhero.com. And by the way, I looked, there's spectacular pictures from the moon on that. This has been Business Talk with Jim Campbell. Thanks to Basil. Thanks to all our heroes.
Thank you, Jimmy.
Thanks to our national audience. We'll have another edition next Sunday on Business Talk with Jim Campbell. And welcome now to our segment 5, which is Overtime. It's exclusively for Yale Radio. It's our annual pilgrimage to Omaha. Warren Buffett and the Berkshire Hathaway annual meeting. That's tonight on Business Talk with Jim Campbell. Lawrence Cunningham's a professor at the George Washington University Law School. Larry's an authority on corporate governance, corporate culture, corporate law. Been on our show to talk about his book, Berkshire Beyond Buffett, The Enduring Value of Values, the unique culture of Berkshire Hathaway. also the editor of the Buffett Essay Symposium with Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger, for which he was also on the show when we broadcast from the lobby of the Omaha Hilton for the Berkshire annual meeting 2 years ago. And just out now to coincide with this upcoming weekend's Berkshire Hathaway annual meeting, the Warren Buffett Shareholder Stories from Inside the Berkshire Hathaway Annual Meeting, edited by Larry and his wife, Stephanie Cubas. He's a graduate of the University of Pennsylvania and the Cardozo Law Schools. He's a real estate consultant in New York City. Joining us right now from Omaha. Welcome back, Larry. How are you?
It's great to be back again with you, Jim. Everything is fine here in Omaha.
Oh, my God. Reading your book got me all the juices flowing again. Before I start, I want to briefly, though, John and Newsy and I, as we were preparing for this show, we found out this week that Berkshire All-Star Oriental Trading President, CEO Sam Taylor, who was on our show, in fact, led off our show from Omaha, passed away. He was a humble man. He was a good man, typical of the Berkshire All-Stars. We did not know about that, so we want to just mention that in passing. I assume you knew Sam as well?
Yes, we did. We have a tribute to him in this book written by
That's right.
Friend of his, Phil Terry.
What's your favorite part of the weekend, by the way?
You know, it's sort of like trying to figure out which child of mine is my favorite. You know, I love them all in different ways. I mean, the Q&A, you know, remains the pinnacle and the original magnet and draw, and it's pretty exceptional. And I guess right up there for me is just meeting all my friends that I've made through Berkshire over the years, and that can happen during the meeting or at many of the satellite events. And I think it's really that's what it comes down to, is catching up with friends.
Tell us, why'd you put this book together, Larry, and why do 40,000 people trek to Omaha, particularly now that you can watch it live stream on Yahoo?
We put the book together because we think the shareholders are one of the most important parts of Berkshire culture, and yet it really haven't been studied so much. And I think the reason they come year after year after year is because they really are special. They have a set of values in common that are really part of Berkshire, and they're just as important to Berkshire's longevity as who will succeed Warren Buffett. You need to have very high-quality shareholders that get the Berkshire culture in order for Berkshire to thrive. And so we wanted to start focusing on the shareholders.
It's a great point. Briefly, because I don't think most people understand this, how different a Berkshire annual meeting is versus the typical corporate. The typical corporate ones are staged, right, and over in like 5 minutes.
That's right. And very few people attend.
Yes.
And nothing is accomplished. No ideas are achieved. If they have a high turnout, it's because there's some activist agitating and there's some dissension. And Berkshire is completely different. It's a partnership-like atmosphere where people are trying to learn the business, understand decisions that have been made, and in that sense, even though it's this year, I think he's expecting 42,000. It's a huge turnout, and yet in some ways, it still feels like a pretty small company that. They've had this meeting for nearly 40 years or so. Back in the old days, there were only a few hundred people. And it still has a feeling. I mean, obviously, it's a mob scene, but there's still a sense of there are two guys, Warren and Charlie, answering questions of shareholders and talking to them as if they're partners in a business rather than someone's a fancy CEO and these are mere minions in a shareholder pool. It's a very special, very big, but still very special kind of company feeling.
Somebody in your book says it, too, that it's sort of like changing your oil. You go out there to declutter from the rest of the world, and it's a whole way of life. It's a different way of thinking. It's a rational, independent way. The whole deal is really special.
That's right. That piece is by Shane Parrish, who is a Canadian investor who writes a really thoughtful newsletter and blog called Farnham Street, which is the address, obviously, where Berkshire is headquartered. And that idea of a oil change for the soul is he makes this point that the people who attend are the people he'd like to be. They're smart, they're thoughtful, they're rational, and that's how he wants to be. And the other neat point that he makes, and others echo, is that the answers are the same every year. When Warren and Charlie are holding forth on that stage, they're not making up new points or developing new principles. They're time-tested, old-fashioned principles about patience, long-term, integrity, candor, quality businesses, good returns on invested capital. It's the same answers every year, but that's sort of the point. There's a stability, a reliability that's very assuring to people, and it also just makes sense. And so that oil change is like, well, you just need to stay clean. You need to be rejuvenated, refreshed. I mean, And that's a big important part of the whole catharsis, I think, of the weekend.
Have you figured this out yet? I watch these guys eat C's peanut butter brittle for 6 hours and drink cherry Cokes nonstop. Why they don't go to the bathroom more often? I don't see them ever go to the bathroom.
they must have a secret gene, because I certainly couldn't do that, and most people couldn't. And I mean, it's amazing too.
They're 90-year-old guys too.
Yeah, the physical stamina, the intellectual stamina, it's extraordinary, and it's infectious. So they have modeled a leadership and a philosophy that people in this crowd. Again, it's something very special about the Berkshire shareholders. These are not the typical shareholders in corporate America. These are mostly individuals and families. 40% of the stock, besides Warren's stake, is owned by individuals, families, not institutions, not big indexing. The biggest group together of shareholders here are people, and they've taken. They're not mindlessly imitating what Warren and Charlie do, but they get this modeling. These guys are friends. Warren and Charlie have been friends since 1959. They're business partners. They share ideas. They treat each other with enormous respect. They'll sit there all day and answer questions from people. They show that stamina, and other people all around Omaha this weekend at dozens of different events do a similar kind of thing. Take questions, answer them all day, debate them all day, according to a fairly basic set of principles.
You know, I think your biggest contribution to the whole Berkshire thing is this pointing out this soft stuff, that the values and the culture are what make Berkshire special, not necessarily just the intrinsic value and float that we all, leaped on as insights. How did Berkshire get such special shareholders? Companies get the shareholders they deserve, right?
That's a great quote. And I think the answer in Berkshire's case is that the company was created by an investor, and it's been run by an investor. Very few big companies were created by investors for investors, whether it's ExxonMobil and the Rockefellers, or Google and Larry Page, or Facebook and Zuckerberg, or IBM and Tom Watson. Those are business people, entrepreneurs, managers, and nothing against any of those guys, but you're going to have a very different culture than a company like Berkshire, which was founded by an investor. His primary and almost total focus is on the shareholders, the fellow shareholders, the partners. Now, that means we take care of customers, take care of employees, take care of the planet, and all this other stuff, but the glue that holds the whole operation together is that it's a group of shareholders, and it's run for shareholders, and that mindset has just been part of the company from the beginning, and the rest of the shareholders get that. The shareholders of ExxonMobil get that too. So, very big institutions and large conglomerations of money are the big investors in those companies. They're not as visible. They're not as important at Berkshire Hathaway.
I've always thought that, and the word's been used too, that they view Charlie and Warren as a didactic platform. They're basically teachers.
Yeah, that's a very important point, Jim. What they've done for decades is educate the shareholders about the special features of Berkshire. And what that has done, in terms of your point about getting the shareholders you deserve, is it's mostly weeded out the shareholders who are interested in a quick buck, or they'd like to buy the stock and flip it in 3 months, or the group of shareholders that insist that a company has to just be focused on one thing and not allow for this diversified conglomerate, and a shareholder that is concerned about the tax consequences of corporate policy, such as paying dividends or selling companies. And so Warren and Charlie have spent their careers at Berkshire educating the shareholders on how they think about the business, and the effect has been that shareholders who like the knowledge, who appreciate those tenets of permanence, of reinvesting capital rather than distributing it, of retaining businesses rather than selling, those who get that kind of model are those who have stuck around mostly. It's not perfect. There are some short-term shareholders in the mix, but the overwhelming demographic of the Berkshire shareholder is an educated one who have learned those lessons that have been taught and agree with them.
Listen to Business Talk with Jim Campbell over the Business Talk Radio Network, 350 stations around the country. Go to businesstalkradio.com, find the station closest to you, access our archive of podcasts, listen over the Internet. We got more from Omaha coming right up with Larry Cunningham. Stay with us. You're listening to Business Talk with Jim Campbell. This is segment 5 overtime exclusively for Yale Radio, WYBC, and we thank Jeff for staying with us. I want to start off with getting your comments on some great Charlie Mungerisms from the thing. I offend more people than Buffett does, and I'm satisfied with the level of disapproval. Talk about how different his personality is from Warren. Warren doesn't like that kind of stuff, right?
Right. By all measures, Charlie is very self-assured and doesn't suffer fools gladly, prefers the company of a book to the company of a person that is not on his level. Warren came out of the Dale Carnegie School trying to please people. A lot of that's the fact that he grew up admiring his father a great deal. His mother was emotionally very volatile, and Buffett was just had a tough time with strangers. So he really made it a point to try to win over people, and by all means, he's very easy to talk to. Charlie, intimidating. That's just the way they are. It's a great team. They're, like Lewis and Martin. That's what makes it work.
Now, talking about Charlie talking about a circle of competence, I realized I needed to compete against idiots, and luckily there's a large supply. How do you think that he and Warren have guarded against arrogance?
That's a great point, because Charlie has a great quote about arrogance, and to the effect of if you don't know what you're talking about, you run the risk of doing really stupid things.
Yeah.
By that he means arrogance. So I think the way they guard against it is by trying to know more than anybody else what they're talking about. And generally speaking, they do.
Yeah.
And, I always remember Warren's son, Howard, once saying that, and this is kind of a sad story, saying how it was always tough to talk with Dad about something at the dinner table because he always knew more than you did, whatever you brought up.
Now, he talked about the impact of value investors, and it's a great quote. You wouldn't want them to marry into your family. It's like fox hunting, the pursuit of the uneatable by the unspeakable. I don't think they're good. I don't think they're good for America when you average it out. Now, you're in the business. What's your feeling on activist investors?
That's the old Oscar Wilde quote about fox hunters. I think you got to be a value investor. You've always got to look for the inherent worth of something. Otherwise, I don't think you can really call yourself an investor. Otherwise, you're just sort of playing the game.
Over time, Charlie, our growth over time has been related to ignorance removal. There's a lot of it left. The interesting thing, though, he talks about in his letter that probably the biggest deal is the mistakes or the omission that Buffett, from missing deals, has given up maybe $50 billion of foregone value.
Right.
What's your thoughts on that?
Well, that's another way they try to learn. I think Walmart is one of those that he's thinking about. There was a time where they looked at Walmart and decided not to buy it. They overanalyzed it, and Charlie calls that thumb sucking, when you spend too much time waiting to pull the trigger and trying to make up your mind when the opportunity is right there. I think it's just all part of that constant learning process. And this is a guy, Munger, who studies human psychology. There's books. Anytime he recommends a book, you ought to read it, and you'll be surprised at how diverse the territory is that he covers. He reads, still to this day, 91, 92 years old.
Yeah.
He reads two to three books a week.
And he's blind.
He's blind in one eye. His one eye was removed, so he had a bad cataract operation. The other eye it's hard for him to see, but he reads 2 to 3 books a week.
Amazing.
And he does.
What about, this has always fascinated me, comparing GE to Buffett, to Berkshire, and GE basically just put up the white flag on conglomeration, and Buffett is thriving.
Yeah.
What do you think? How do you analyze that?
I think GE's approach was really the driver of their effort into financial services. What started as a nice way to help people buy refrigerators, which is what the genesis of that business was, that finance business. turned into a way for GE to help make quarterly earnings. It was a honeypot, a financial honeypot for them to hit the numbers. And I lived in Fairfield, Connecticut for many years, knew a lot of people from GE. It's a great company, but the mentality was hitting your quarterly numbers under Jack Welch. And I know he's a demigod of management gurus, but his approach, I think, was the fatal flaw was trying to satisfy Wall Street by hitting the number every quarter, because what you do is you end up doing, as Buffett says, you end up doing silly things that aren't in the long-term interest of the business. And I think that's the fundamental difference. What Buffett does, Buffett used the insurance business as a financing tool so that he could compound more money for the benefit of Berkshire Hathaway shareholders without pursuing a strategy that would jeopardize those shareholders. So Ajit Jain is under no pressure to hit quarterly numbers. If they suddenly have a $2 million drop in the premiums coming in from National Indemnity under Ajit, Buffett doesn't say, wait a minute, we've got to hit our numbers for Wall Street. He says, great, fine. That just means pricing is irrational and we're not going to become irrational. Totally different mindsets. Buffett's mindset was everything was geared for long-term, sustainable maximization of returns to shareholders, meaning him and his fellow shareholders. GE's foray into financial engineering, it was financial engineering. It wasn't to the long-term benefit of GE.
And that's perfect lead into where I want to go, because to me, if you cater yourself to Wall Street eventually sees through it anyway and dings you. So it's not even worth doing. I believe IBM's been doing financial engineering for several years, that roadmap that they had. And so is IBM, are they in big trouble? And why? What is Warren's fascination with IBM, given he hasn't touched tech in 50 years?
Well, he's been asked this 2-3 years in a row ever since he started buying IBM. And his answers to that have always been less than satisfactory. They haven't been the typical Buffett answer, like when it comes to why did you buy the railroad? He's got an irreplaceable asset that's going to generate great returns for the next 50, 100 years. What's IBM's moat? He was asked 2 years ago, and he really fumbled around for the answer. And this year he was asked the same question, and he fumbled around for the answer. And Charlie fumbled around for the answer as well. Interesting. The real answer is this, and I know this because I actually had a friend who was visiting, and I said, would you just ask him what made him pull the trigger on IBM after studying the financials for 50 years? Why all of a sudden? Because he knows IBM as well as anybody. He knows the numbers. He knows Bill Gates. What made him finally pull the trigger? And the answer is a story that Buffett subsequently told on CNBC. So I'm not telling anything that is non-public information. But what Buffett said was, talking to his managers, they would tell him that IBM it's a very unfortunate metaphor. He said IBM is like AIDS. You can't get rid of it. Once you have it, you can't get rid of it. And Buffett thought that was hysterical and just a great business to have, that if it's there and it's embedded in your infrastructure, you can't get rid of it. And it reminded him, I have no doubt it reminded him of American Express, because he always tells the story of why he bought American Express when he did, twice. He bought it once during the salad oil scandal and another time years later, talking to people about it, and they would say, we can't get rid of Amex. You can't get rid of it. You got to have it. It's a business. If you run a business, you got to have American Express. That same mentality of owning something that you can't get rid of, I think, is what really attracted Buffett to IBM ultimately. After years of looking at this cash flow machine that was buying its own stock back, inducing the stock price, and yet, as you and I know, and the world is coming to see, this whole move to the cloud is what framed people from actually having to have IBM. You know, the cloud is sort of like, the ultimate HIV drug. You know, you finally can get rid of IBM, and people are doing it. And I think it's very controversial among Berkshire shareholders, like true investors who own Berkshire for a long time and love his rationale for buying the railroad. It's very controversial. They don't get it, and they don't think his explanation.
I agree with that, and they're talking about getting into the cloud, but the cloud isn't going to have the margins that the mainframe business always had.
Right.
Their moat is shrinking, and I'm worried that do you think there's any chance that Buffett may just get stubborn over this and say, I'm not going to want to admit a mistake and just hang too long, or he's too rational?
Yes, no, he will, because he did that with Tesco. He's always slow to pull the trigger. I can't think, the only stock, and this is a bad example because it was a great success, but he was early on Fannie Mae. He and Charlie were one of the first to see that Fannie Mae was just one of the great business models of all time, when no one really knew what they did. Ultimately, he ended up selling the stock years before the crisis because he felt that their promises to grow 15% a year, and again, we're getting back to the GE thing, promising Wall Street 15% a year growth was going to promote bad behavior.
Which it did.
He said that publicly, he said it often, and it came true. And to his great credit, Berkshire was not one of the companies, one of the investors who got caught owning Fannie Mae when it blew up. But in general, I think he will give IBM time to try to do what they're doing. He's loyal.
Yeah.
His other aspect is he's very loyal. And he stepped up and bought more stock, in the last 6 months. So he's not changing his mind anytime soon.
Now we'll talk about a good story here. Geico, this is amazing for a consumer company to have grown their market share from 2% to 10%. That's almost unheard of, and they passed Allstate, where my dad worked his whole career. Do you think they will catch State Farm at 19%?
Ultimately, yes.
Wow.
It just makes sense the way the business is going. Everything over time shifts to a lower cost model. It's an inherent advantage that doesn't go away. And in an age where information is getting democratized through the internet, I think the answer has to be yes.
I don't want to get too technical for folks, but I just want to see if you have a gut feel on this. Do you have a sense what Berkshire's cost of capital is?
No. And Buffett was asked this last year, and he said, I like to say our cost of capital is the second best idea that we look at, which is a way of saying we don't really carry a strict cost of capital in our head, but if our second best deal is going to generate 10%, and our best idea will generate more than 10%, that 10% is our cost of capital.
In fact, it's intrinsic value is sort of a proxy for it too, right? I mean, he's in terms of the growth side of that.
Yeah.
It's just a matter of the cost of capital's got to be less, which obviously it is because the market wouldn't value. Do you think they're going to hit $1 trillion of market value?
Ultimately, yeah, sure. I think they've got core businesses that will keep compounding with the economy, and ultimately they'll get there. Yeah.
Now, I read that in the energy businesses, he's building another monopoly type model at some point. But on the pure financial, people have said if you take EBITDA less capex, it's actually negative cash flow. Is that just looking at it wrongly?
No, that's correct. But these are high capex businesses at times, and what Buffett really likes about it is that it generates a regulated return on that capex. So ultimately, they're going to get a good, solid return. Call it 12%, whatever the regulators permit. And in a 2% T-bill world, that looks pretty good.
Now I want to talk a little bit about if we'd been able to invest in Berkshire in 1964, we'd be hugely wealthy folks. There's teachers, as you know, that retired in Omaha with $700 million. What is a baby Berkshire out there right now? Are there a couple? And I know obviously Markel is the one that everybody talks about.
Yes, Markel's the first one that comes to mind because it does have the Buffett model, insurance with as the financing engine, and then getting into businesses run by a very Buffett-esque team. But beyond that, boy, there's a Berkshire type company called RPM Industries. It's a paint company. They own Rust-Oleum and a bunch of brands that you'd recognize. But it's in the paint business. But their acquisition strategy is very similar to Berkshire's. They buy companies, they leave them alone, but they do put them together in the back office and their sales teams, and they have a real Buffett-type culture.
Do they have
culture?
Do they have a Buffett-type individual?
No. They have the founder was a Buffett-type individual who left a very strong culture. Full disclosure, I've owned the stock for several years, and I'm not promoting it. It's actually a little richly valued for my taste these days, but like everything else. But I can't think of too many other companies that and when I think of baby Buffetts, I'm thinking I tend to think more of the culture because whatever the baby Buffett is out there, we probably don't know what it is yet.
Yeah, that's the trouble. So we won't be able to jump on board there. Now, one of the things that was interesting in Buffett's letter, and you obviously knew this, but I didn't realize it took him so long. He actually hung around the textiles business for 18 years. So in retrospect, looking back on a long-term basis, is Eddie Lampert maybe where everybody's evaluating him too quickly?
Yeah, that's a great question. I hadn't thought of that comparison, and I would say the difference is that whereas Buffett tried to turn around the textile business by buying new machines and thinking he could ultimately get it to work, Lampert really is not investing in the basic Sears business. He's if you've ever been in a Sears store in the last 5 years, you know that he doesn't believe it. Literally, he said this. That he doesn't think investing in lights and carpeting is what drives people to stores. Well, yeah, actually, it does.
And not to mention that Warren didn't try, I assume, and run the textile business himself. Like Lampert thinks he can run a retail business part-time by himself, apparently.
Yeah. I think that's a very rose-colored way of looking at what Eddie's doing.
As we get down to the end, were you, I don't want to say happy, but do you feel it's just a good thing for the markets that Stevie Cohen finally got caught basically on insider trading, and he's had to basically redo everything and pull out and become a family thing? Is this a good thing, or you think the memories will be short and it'll be going on again in Wall Street in a couple of years?
Well, I thought, I don't know what was going on there, and but there were a lot of guys that got indicted, and a friend of mine always says, walks like a duck and quacks like a duck. But so I don't know the particulars, and they didn't do anything. They've never found anything on Stevie, but there was a time there where you could play close to the line, as Buffett would call it. And I unfortunately, this latest interpretation of the laws, the insider trading laws, which states that the guy, if the guy who gives you the tip isn't getting rewarded for it, if you're not paying him off or something, then it's okay. To me, that's opened the door again. And I think we're going to see a lot more people people playing close to the line. So I just wish the SEC would come out and put a definition of insider trading on their website. They still don't have one, if you can believe it.
That's a good point, yes. Well, this is always one of my favorite shows of the year. Carol Loomis, Jeff Matthews, both legends. Carol's book, again, is Tap Dancing to Work, Warren Buffett on Practically Everything, 1966 to 2012. And Jeff's book, again, is Warren Buffett's Successor, Who It Is and Why It Matters, amongst, I think, 3 total books. And are you still doing your blog actively?
Occasionally, yep. Whenever the mood swings.
Yeah, give people the name of it.
It's Jeff Matthews is not making this up.
It's great fun to read. The podcast of the 60-minute commercial-free version of the show will be available at WYBC.com, and you can search iTunes Business Talk with Jim Campbell. Again, next Sunday, we're going to look at the new book out on Ronald Reagan. Thanks again to Carol Loomis, Jeff Matthews. Thanks to the loyal Yale audience for staying with us in overtime. See you next Sunday on Business Talk with Jim Campbell.